Test. Test.
Testing,
Test.
testing.
Test. 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 This one is number 5.
I think we figured it out.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming to the main event of this entire event. I know you've been waiting for this for several hours, so we'll get right into it. But if you don't know me, you may have seen my tweets on Twitter, account called The Blockchain Socialist. I have a podcast, and so what we're doing is a live interview with 2 members of a group called the Black Swan DAO. But maybe to start off, I guess, before I start butchering, trying to describe what it is and what they do, maybe if you guys want to start off to describe who you guys are and what Black Swan is to you.
Sure. Hello, I'm Calum Bowden, one of the co-founders of Black Swan, and I, in another hat that I wear, work on a project called Trust, which we describe as a network of utopian conspirators. And I think that Black Swan kind of emerges from this notion of utopian conspiracy, trying to not only be critical of the world that we as artists were operating in, but to try and respond to that critique by prototyping, experimenting, and playing with infrastructures. And so Black Swan, as it stands now, is a kind of artistic research endeavor and software project responding to the local issues of the Berlin art scene and the contemporary art world, and trying to work with creative practitioners to better understand the psychosocial affordances of blockchains.
And I'm Penny Rafferty. I worked predominantly in Berlin for many, many years as a theorist and writer. And I guess like a big part of what drew me to DAO thinking and DAO philosophy was trying to sort of understand the affordances and the mutability that was potentially able to be exchanged and interchanged throughout the Berlin art scene. And so particularly utilizing a test case and then trying to apply and modulate this sort of spectrum of ideas and theories in creating a more kind of interdependent section of the art world that could potentially create other models and systems and sorts that would eventually feed into and modulate the next generation of artists.
Cool. So I think the name Black Swan DAO is pretty eye-catching, because I think when people obviously know about the like Black Swan events type of phenomenon where something happens that you don't really expect to happen, or something doesn't happen that you expect to happen, and you consider it a Black Swan event. But I was wondering if you can maybe explain a bit where that name comes from, and like, is that related to uncertainty or risk or things like this?
I mean, I think you kind of already outlined the underlying definition of it, but I think like the way in which the terminology was used is that, and I think that's also something like listening to the talks today as well, is that sometimes in terms of Black Swan, it's this idea that actually Black Swans were not recognized as swans because people ultimately believed that a swan should be white, essentially. And until Black Swans were discovered and registered as such, then there was sort of like this fantastical prophecy of unbelieving. And I think that's also what happens very much within like the rhetoric of the arts. There is a heavily rooted notion of tradition, prophecy, terminology, and this mode of not believing that there can be another way because it's so heavily rooted in a system that we pertain to be the only system, and allowing those kind of affordances and to implement this way of existing as an alternative to the point to which then you recognize that, you know, there always has potentially being another way or another version, but until we actually start to notice or to view this in practice. Like it's still an imaginarium.
Do you want to add anything to that? Or?
Yeah, I think for me it's also taking from Nassim Taleb's like theory of Black Swan events and thinking like in a hyperstatistical way that Black Swan DAO will eventually become as like understood within frameworks of reality as Black Swans became. So I think it's like a hopeful, again, it's like a form of utopian conspiracy. Eventually Black Swan DAOs will be recognized as art worlds in and of themselves.
Yeah, when I hear you guys speak, it's almost like I think as well, because you're working in the context of blockchain, and there is this belief, generally, I guess, that a blockchain is used for a specific way or like for a specific thing, and with a high focus on profiting, that it's almost like a black swan that you can find something else for it at this point.
I really like this interpretation also, because like a catalyst for Black Swan DAO is also a general skepticism with the claims coming out of the blockchain industry around the use cases of the technology, because like as you're saying, the main proven use case is making some people really rich, maybe crowdfunding. Sorry if you work on protocols. But ultimately, we wanted to set our sights on like really understanding what this technology might do for our community of artists and for ourselves as artists trying to operate in a increasingly alienating art world.
Yeah. So do you want to explain a bit what the what were the issues in the art world that you were involved in? So in Berlin, basically, that got you like to begin working on Black Swan.
I mean, when Black Swan was like first a thought farm, it was very much coming out of a program called Reality from Kunstwerke Gallery. And the notion was that there was a lot of conversations going on in that space about the accelerated gentrification, the lack of interdependence within the art scene itself, the gender inequality, the disenfranchisement of certain practices based on a traditional scope, also the lack of funding and also the lack of accountability in terms of what is known in the art scene as grooming. So,
interesting term.
Yeah, basically the idea of grooming in the art world is that quite often an artist will kind of cut their teeth inside project spaces that are typically underfunded, if not they're just energetically produced by the community for the community. And an artist will define, organize, register their practice within these spaces, and as soon as that has gathered enough kind of hype and enough structure around it, that they'll be picked up by either a blue chip gallery or a museum or a space where they can then enter the market system. And I was doing a lot of research on how we could make this a more kind of equitable system in terms of these artist-led spaces and also the conversations between these legacy institutions and these spaces that are nascent spaces for the creation of art. And what became very apparent to me at that point was that a lot of these legacy institutions, they endemically profit on these early spaces, but they don't often give back to the early spaces. So Black Swan was originally conceived with the idea that they would be held accountable to almost creating a fertile ground for these artists to begin their practices, which I think is also a little different in terms of most DAO models. When Black Swan was conceived, there was an idea of like splitting up the stakeholders and the users. So a stakeholder would be an institution, would be a museum, would be a collector, a patron, who actually then offered resources, whether that be money itself or studio space, and also utilizing, I mean, it's very, very local in terms of like the Berlin art scene. So for example, all the galleries close in August. That's dead space that's not used. Could you give that over to a nascent practice so that they could build upon it? And so the idea was that these stakeholders would then place their resources into the pool, and then the artists themselves would utilize a sort of protocol to envisage proposals that could make use of these resources. And then they would vote upon who actually gathers these resources based on the project itself, which is also a little bit different to how the art world typically works, because it manifests itself often on a gift economy. So as an artist, you will be gifted certain resources that might not actually be what you want to create in terms of your vision, but you actually model a proposal around a certain resource set. And so it was very much about actually, instead of the artist working towards the demand of what was offered, instead it was like looking at the pool of what was available in the Berlin art scene, and then those artworks being constructed based on what the artist wanted to do, and then utilizing the resources, which often can be a kind of chain of resources, which also doesn't really often happen in the art world. You typically get like one funding grant or one residency space, and actually it's much more beneficial for these resources to be chained in order to have a more defining set of tools, which of course are inevitably social when it comes to creating and practicing art. And so there was like a lot of kind of different models that were maybe like a little bit bastardized in terms of like initial DAO philosophy, and how that was kind of positioned in the history of DAOs. And I think this also comes to a very sort of social dynamic in terms of holding these legacy institutions to stake within an art scene. And of course, this is like not in any way unbeneficial for them, because with every young scene, if it actually gathers the support that it needs at that moment to be created, the longevity of that means that those legacy institutions will inevitably profit further, because the artists will have what they need as they're growing. And so I actually think this notion of like the starving artist doesn't make great art. I'm not so into this kind of concept of like that we have to suffer and we have to exist in scarcity in order to energize our creative strata.
So then, so based on this, then you guys came up with Cygnet, which, I mean, do you want to describe that maybe?
Sure. So Black Swan started from like a speculative proposal for how to begin responding to this critique of the local Berlin contemporary art scene. And as I was saying before, being like skeptical of the claims of the blockchain industry, but at the same time being very inspired for the possible ways that it might distribute value differently within networks and respond to the failures of platform capitalism to protect the like data rights of its users. And so we wanted to not just kind of jump into using blockchain technology, but to try and understand what use cases it might have for our community. And so we devised about 1.5 years of experiments to begin understanding different variables that we planned to eventually go into a DAO toolkit that we want to make available to artist communities. And so we started looking at decision making. We then looked at tropes of organizations and hierarchies and the ways that different organizational forms relate to each other. Then we looked at ontologies of value and the way that artistic practices and creative process more generally generates many types of value within a social context that are not well captured by narrow and reductive market values. And so we wanted to understand that better. And So from these experiments, we began prototyping a consensus building tool that we've since called Cygnet, which means baby swan. So it's our kind of baby.
Sticking to the theme.
Exactly. Yeah, we have the swan theme. We will carry it through until the swan is dead.
Like, is Cygnet the name of a bit like when it's
that is
born,
what
it's
it is called in English. Yeah, it's called it. No, it's just like that's the word.
But it sounds. It's okay. I thought because it says net at the end. I thought it was.
Well,
like
our website is
internet.
sig.network. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. Awesome.
Smart.
Yeah. Branding is key to DAOs. And so from this initial activity around decision-making models, we looked specifically at quadratic voting because we were interested in how it offered a more nuanced way of expressing opinions, but we're skeptical of the ways, like just how complicated it was. And we thought that artists wouldn't like using this, basically, was our assumption going into the experiment. So we put it up against one person, one vote, and we put it up against a lottery to think about removing agency and seeing like what are the consequences of that. And we were really surprised to find that the 10 participants that we were working with like all really enjoyed using quadratic voting, even if they didn't understand how it worked. And I can explain a bit. Like quadratic voting offers participants like a range of things called voice credits that are spent across proposals. You can spend them however you want. And then to calculate the vote, the square root is taken of the voice credits spent, and then that's all added up. And so we took these insights from this initial exercise and began prototyping a quadratic voting tool that would make this relationship between voice credits and votes more intuitive and visual. So we tried to build visual indicators that told you how strong your vote was going to be. And so and we further refined this in since the year that we've been developing it, so that artists generally like using it. And actually a recent test case was with the Sphere, who presented earlier, where they had the most users of the tool that we've ever had. And it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of questions, I think, around like proposal formation, like, which makes a lot of sense because that's where ideas are generated and created. And then once voting happens, things get pretty silent. Like you don't hear from the participants anymore once they're voting because it just kind of works.
Right. So, I mean, it seems to me that because there is this question, I think, a lot in the earlier panel, like people always asking like, oh, well, if we use a new technology, like, will anybody understand it? And I guess what you kind of saw, I guess you guys kind of had that expectation as well. Like, is anybody going to understand this? Because I guess if you explain it as we're taking the square root of the amount of like points you're putting here and then doing that, a lot of people are not really going to understand it. But I guess what you found is that having a proper interface that sort of shows, that gets the idea across of what they're doing, I guess helps expose that a bit better.
I mean, I think that it would be reductive to understand it purely through an interface. There's like also a lot of social contracts and checking in and also being like present and available to onboard people, not purely through like a sort of instruction sheet, but to be there. And I mean, I think this is also something that has been like fundamental to Black Swan from the very early days, but is to continually understand that like conversation is extremely valid when you're actually trying to create these structures for cultures and communities. And I think also in terms of understanding Cygnet, there's also really a social dynamic to it as well, because not only is it in the sense that, okay, a certain amount of proposals will be granted those resources, but also by that community reading through those proposals, that also offers like an alternative economy in terms of like, I understand what you're trying to do with your practice. Maybe I can exchange with a certain set of labors that you are asking for in terms of your proposal. Maybe we can exchange together, maybe you have something of value, and also to enrich the conversations and the practices that are part of that community. So instead of understanding that you're submitting your proposal in order to benefit from your individual practice, you're also creating this entanglement of knowledge and conversation. And that in itself, I believe, will actually aid the community in creating a sort of stronghold where it becomes interdependent. And it's not purely based on the technology to solidify its kind of circumference of exchange.
So you're saying like the proposal, because the proposals are public, that it helps almost like that scene, that cultural scene or art scene to like, oh, that's what you're doing.
Yeah, this creates a conversation, it creates a critique, which I think is also progressive. I don't believe that criticizing or taking a different viewpoint, I think that this can construct better, in a sense, creations. And so by having that ability to be able to understand what your peers are doing, that's also, of course, dismantling this notion of the individual artist, and which is being in terms of like the traditions and the history of art, that it's very much kind of speculated on this notion of an individual genius. And actually, I think that when you really begin to unpick these kind of models and moments of art history, you find a whole set of protagonists that have fed into those conversations. And I think that what we're trying to do is show that these protagonists are there, rather than sort of isolating in terms of, okay, you won, so to speak. There's actually, there's an infrastructure around that.
Right. So to me, it seems like what you were saying earlier, like you're separating the people who are funding art with the people who are working on art, and then using this quadratic voting as a type of interface between, almost like to be able to converse with, to come to consensus between these two.
There's no involvement from the resource contributors.
True. The consensus amongst the scene, at least.
Yeah, amongst the scene. And maybe just jumping on what Penny was mentioning, but in the research experiments that we've done, we found that when, like, following a more traditional grant proposal approach, where you're expected to, like, put in some fully fledged idea for this thing that you're expected to follow, or, like, everybody knows you're not going to actually do what you've written on the page, but there's this expectation that you have to articulate the idea as though it's a fully formed thing. Following this more traditional proposal approach increases feelings of competition amongst participants, because it creates this like more alienating environment where people are stood behind these ideas that they're trying to perform as being like immutable in some way. And I think that in like learning from this and learning how important the like off-chain facilitation that we do in any funding cycle or research distribution round is to the process, we've tried to build more time into like the proposal development phase, so that people can be in conversation with each other's ideas before they're fully formed. And then I think this also furthers the work in like demystifying the individual genius artist and like defetishizing the commodity form, and showing how like conversations and interdependent relations are at the base of like everything in the world already, but making that more explicit and inviting people into these processes produces more collective outputs.
Yeah, that was pretty well said. One of the things, the next thing I wanted to talk about, because so Penny, you've been, and you wrote for a part of the book Radical Friends, which is coming out through Furtherfield, which is like an artist collective based in the UK.
It's actually from Torque Press, but
from Torque. Well, it's with Furtherfield in the UK.
I worked with Ruth Catlow, who's the director of Furtherfield,
right,
in the creation of this book. Yeah.
So like in this book, which is I think is already out now, so people can check it.
Yeah, it launched last Thursday at Serpentine.
Yeah, so brand new. But you guys talk about in one of the essays that you wrote with Black Swan was about collective staking, which I think was like kind of getting at what you were talking about, Calum. Do you want to explain that concept a bit? I thought that was a pretty interesting one.
So in a essay that I wrote with Laura Lochte, who's another wonderful swan, we pondered affirmations for art worlds based on mutualism and solidarity. And one of the insights that we propose in this text is art making as a mode of collective staking. And a nice way of thinking about tokens that is kind of initially proposed by Other Internet, of which Laura Lochte was one of the authors of this text, is that tokens are promises. You know, they're not equities, they're not stores of value, as the recent market collapse has shown. They're promises of some like future utility, or they're like promises of a future in some way. And we kind of like this idea of like a token as a promise, as it creates more of a social relation. And so then we're also thinking of like the artist's CV, a highly contested like document in the art world, but that provides an index of the relationships that have gone into any artist's career. So in a CV, you have institutions, you have curators, you have educational experiences, you have all of these different stakeholders of an individual artist's career that we think should be made more explicit, or could be made more explicit. And something that's also nice about staking as it works in blockchain is that it's where tokens are stored in some sort of locked treasury. So they can no longer circulate in the market. So they're kind of becoming a collectivized promise in some way, like where you're saying that you trust the thing that you are staking to such a degree that you're willing to like remove your tokens from circulation. And so we're kind of pondering the ways in which staking could become maybe a more explicit form of commitment making to like the gift giving that Penny was talking about is the normal like modus operandi in the art world. These like expectations of gifting, or how gifts circulate in this very opaque and often like nepotistic way. And so thinking about staking as somehow making explicit commitments.
Yeah, I like that, because I think obviously when people are thinking of staking, when they're, crypto pilled or whatever, they're thinking about is like staking into a new DeFi thing that's going to give them an APY or whatever. And so because that's what people are associating with, that's what they kind of think of it as, purely a financial stake with an expectation of a promise of a financial gain. But I think the point that you're making is that we collectively stake probably quite a bit already. We just don't really think of it in that way, and that we're staking on something happening in the future that is not financially motivated or does not really have much to do with finance. But I imagine as well, I was speaking with Penny earlier about this, but that I feel that it seems that there is staking in the art world, or I would think that there is staking in the art world, and that's where like all of the money goes in terms of like where grants are coming from, or where very wealthy collectors are maybe putting their money. That is kind of a form of collective staking, but it's kind of like a anti-democratic form of collective staking. It's still collective, but it's like not that many people are in the collective that are doing the staking. And so that sort of induces people from elsewhere with not as much resources to move in that direction, or to, incentivize to go where the money is, almost, I would think. But yeah, so I guess the point here that I'm making is, it seems that what you're trying to, I guess, maybe expand upon is how to make that collectiveness like more explicit, and therefore like impose that, this needs to be more democratic or something like that.
I guess it's also in this like the collectors all staking to the same artist. This is about minimizing risk, and I guess it's often like market risk because these are investments that they're making when they're buying the art. And what if through interdependence or through like solidarity and mutualism, artists can share that risk a bit more? So it's not like one artist succeeds on the heads of 100 artists or whatever, but rather they're all like collectivizing the staking that is already happening.
Can I just run on?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I think it's kind of what I also just want to like reshuffle a little bit, is that in terms of like where the money is held in the art world, like I know that we're all kind of like taught to understand this as like a sort of monster and that we shouldn't interact, that we should like take the side road and but then still want some of the resources. I think, like, in my personal experience, like, opening up these types of conversations to holders of economy within the art world and to holders of the resources, actually, what I've found as a sort of response is that they're actually very open for these conversations. And that in the same ways that, just relating it back to DAOs, you know, that there is always a problem with sort of voting fatigue, like how many proposals there are, how much hours you have to go through. And I think in terms of like the art world, I think there's also a sort of fatigue. There's thousands upon thousands of artists, and those resources, how is one humanly going to move and shift through the dynamics of these artists? And therefore, as Calum said, is specifically kind of channeled to a group of artists that we see continually performing well within the arts. But actually, is this not more about the fact that there is a wall between us as practitioners and those who are holding resources, and that actually maybe by creating more of a sort of osmosis or creating more of a social space to be able to determine what artists need and what also these, in a sense, stewards of art want to, in terms of how much they want to commit as well. And I think that as the years gone by, I think less and less about sort of us and them. And instead, I try to think about how social norms are mutable and how we can create cultural potentials, and we can sort of offer alternatives that may not actually be the cookie cutter alternative that you've offered up on a plate, but at least that there is some sort of tangible shift or currents that are available in terms of us kind of coming closer together, which may seem actually more utopic than this notion of us and them. But actually, this in itself is very difficult. It takes a lot of energy. You have to go places that like the younger version of me would never want to step foot in. But I think that I feel very positive about it purely through the experiences of, and of course that is as well a privilege to be able to access those spaces. And I think that that's also something that's really important in terms of Black Swan, that this project was not built from being outside the art world, but actually understanding that you've been accepted, but you shouldn't forget what's outside of it. And to create bridges and to understand your position and to try to almost sort of contribute in a backstream rather than only thinking of streamlining how you produce and participate and perform in the art world.
Yeah, I think well, I like what you said earlier, that, and you guys mentioned this in the essay in the book, that one of the things that you like about blockchain actually, or like what I think was like one of the 4 principles of something, I'm forgetting, I'm ruining it, but one of them was the fact that that you can be very mutable, which is against all of the marketing that you hear from the blockchain or crypto industry, that it's all about immutability. It's the fact that there are only 21 million Bitcoin makes it, you know, fantastic and, you know, the next thing. But the fact actually is that you can change these things if you just decide to do it. Kind of like it almost seems like kind of stupid when I say it out loud though, but it's like
like
It's so funny that they think of themselves as immutable when like you could just make another blockchain. You could literally fork it, you know?
right. But it's like this contradiction that there's immutability and there's exit.
Yeah.
Like and there's just you can fork whatever you want, but then you just contradicted the whole immutability arguments. But I think it's I mean what I was saying earlier, but like this is all like marketing just for a very specific type of person to come on board into the crypto ecosystem and put their money in. And I think the type of person who is dumb enough, to put a ton of their money into the crypto ecosystem is someone who's probably really enticed by this type of marketing.
But the crypto ecosystem is purely a worlding, and it's a worlding, it's a reality, it's a form of terraforming another way of participating within a certain social or societal spectrum. And in those modes or means, like, who has that authority to make reality? Technically everyone.
We do.
Yeah. So they can make a reality. We can make a reality.
Right.
And I think that's also something that we often forget, that, reality is a set of collective hallucinations that we agree on. And if we decide on another set of hallucinations, we can also participate and live within that.
All right. You guys see that thing over there, right?
Look over there.
Absolutely. A little disturbing.
Yeah, I think we're a little bit past 30 minutes, so I don't know if I think we probably have to end it here around-ish. Oh, yeah, maybe we should ask a question, yeah.
We should ask a question to them.
Yeah. Well, or should we ask if they have a question for us?
We've got some questions for you. Probably.
Should we do maybe like one question from the audience?
What kind of art do you guys do?
What kind of art do you guys do?
I work in a collective called Social Club, where we create role-played immersive works that test different spectrums of reality and are particularly very long durational, from 72 hours to 58 days.
What's up?
Hard act to go after.
Is yours cooler than that?
Unfortunately, approaching reality shaping from other angles, but currently of the practice that infrastructure can be artistic and should be a part of artistic practice. And I think like encouraging artists and creative practitioners to think infrastructurally and to think about the work that they're doing as infrastructures is really important in getting beyond this like implicit reinforcification of like existing hegemonic powers. Like think about the amount of value that artists have created for Instagram and Facebook, and like if that energy could be put into coalescing alternative platforms, alternative ways of being social, using and leveraging technologies is kind of the work that I do. And also like with trust is the type of work that we're doing.
Destroying hegemonic powers as art and distorting reality.
It's about the way it works.
You can call it interdisciplinary practice.
In art, they call it interdisciplinary.
Research.
All right, cool. Well, thank you guys a lot for being my guinea pigs for the first live interview I've ever done.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Thanks so much.